Yeah, so we're going to talk about architecture. And I think it's the only talk in the conference that has architecture in the title. I don't know. Anyway, so who here identifies themselves as an architect? Okay, we have like about 10 to 15, something like that. Okay. Don't worry, the rest of you, the talk is also for you. Because architecture is not just done by architects, fortunately. Right, so first let me introduce myself. My name is Eltjo Poort. I work for a company that is called CGI. And for those of you who don't know CGI, it is a big global IT services company. We have almost 80,000 employees in over 30 countries around the world. And we do all types of IT services, and one of them, of course, is architecture. And I lead the architecture practice in CGI in the Netherlands. You can see some of my hobbies on this slide. And actually, I have to leave quite quickly after my talk because we have an orchestra rehearsal this afternoon on the other side of the country. So, without further ado, let's talk about architecture. And now, who here was attending this morning's talk by Fred George? Okay, that's quite a small fraction. He was talking about saboteurs, right? He was talking about people that sabotage your agile transformation. And he gave a lot of examples of saboteurs. And on every slide, what was the common denominator? It was the architect, right? The architect was the saboteur. So this is something I'm very used to. So I am an architect. And I have heard all kinds of, qualifications for my job. I think the most fun one is that I am from the dark side, right? The agile transformation is the turning towards the light, and the architects are the enemy that keep you away from that, right? The dark side. So, you know, and I think the way that Fred used the architects as examples of people that sabotage agile transformation is a perfect illustration of this slide. Ever since the agile movement started, there has been this tension between the two groups, where architects are seen as slowing down stuff and causing delays and writing documents that nobody reads. On the other hand, not all architects were equally happy with some of the stuff that was going on in agile teams, where people saw, choices being made quite lightheartedly, with the naive assumption that we can always refactor it later, and then it turns out that the refactoring was a little bit harder than we originally anticipated, and we have seen projects crash because of that. By the way, if you're interested in the way the agile community sometimes acts or behaves, there's a great paper by Philippe Cruchten. It's called Voyage Through the Agile Memeplex, and here Philippe compares the agile movement to a religion, including priests, dogmas, etc., right? And I think that's where the key is to resolving this tension. There are great things in architecture, and actually architectural thinking is necessary to solve some of the more complex problems that we encounter in software engineering. But there's also, of course, great practices in Agile. And what we need to do is we need to look at how we can get the best of both worlds. Both were actually developed about 20 years ago as solutions to the same problem. The problem was the software crisis, where we started to notice that the complexity of software or software-intensive systems and systems of systems was growing so much that the practices that we were using in the 80s and 90s no longer were able to control or to manage that complexity. Well, if they ever had before. But and architects at the time said, what we need to manage all that complexity is we need to be able to reason about that complexity at a higher level of abstraction. And that's, when we started to create models, architectural models, in order to be able to do that. And the Agilists, they saw the same problem, but they said, it's in the way that we deal with change, right? Because the reaction of traditional project managers in the 90s was, if a system became very complex and it got out of hand, was, well, it's the fault of all those changes. What we need to do is we need to tighten down on change control. And the Agile movement was, of course, the inverse reaction to that, where people said, well, let's look at change in another way. Instead of trying to fight change and trying to limit the complexity that way, let us just look at change and see it as a fact of life, embrace it, and see where that takes us. And the rest of it is history. So we can get the best of both worlds. And one of the things that architects can learn from Agile practices is, of course, that we need to learn quickly. We need to adapt quickly. And one of the things that we can quicken up, speed up, is the learning cycle of the team, of the organization. There are other things where you can find a balance. Like, for example, where do you make your decisions? In the third bullet in the middle here, it says decentral where possible and standards where necessary, right? That's also one of the things where you have to actually think about what is the best way, where should we make this decision? And that, of course, the answer to that is always, it depends, right? Some decisions are better made at a central level where you can oversee all of the consequences and where you have all kinds of factors, drivers that make standardization a great idea. And in other situations, you can look at the knowledge that is required to make that decision and say, well, the people who are actually working on that, the team themselves, they know by far the most about these type of problems, so let them make the decisions. And so where the decision is made should not be a matter of whether you are a member of the architecture school or the Agile religion. It should never be a question of dogma. It should always be, and that's the final bullet in the middle there, in the balance, it should be based on business rationale and not on dogma. Right, so let's talk about that first bullet, to architecture, about speeding up your architecture feedback loops. So what is an architecture feedback loop? So when you do architecture, right, you make a design. Maybe you don't make a design, but you have to make an important decision. Are we going to add this feature in this microservice, or is it going to be the responsibility of that microservice, or are we going to write this stuff in Java, or are we going to choose for some kind of a low-code platform, etc. These are the key technical decisions that you make. We call those design decisions, right? They don't always end up in some documented design or anything. But how do you make those decisions? Well, and if you're making those decisions, then there's basically two feedback loops that you have to be aware of to make the right decisions. The first feedback loop is the feedback loop between the stakeholders and the architecture. And this feedback loop is mostly consists of communication, right? Communication from stakeholders. I'm not just talking about business stakeholders here. I'm also talking about developers, about people who are involved in operations, security people, etc. Right? All those people have interests in the system, and you should listen to them, basically. It's the only way to make the right trade-offs when you're making these design decisions. And if you speed up that feedback loop, meaning that you ask for feedback or you get feedback, sometimes you don't ask for it, but they will give it to you anyway. If you speed that up, it will make sure that the stakeholders better understand your design because you talk to them more. But also better understand their drivers and are able to make better decisions because of better trade-offs. And in the end, you get a better fit design. So, of course, when we're talking about architect disaboteur, right, then what we're thinking about is those architects that take 2 months to create an architectural description document. And then, in the end, they take another month to make it absolutely perfect, and then they show it to the stakeholders. That is a very slow feedback loop, right? That's what you don't want. We want to speed that up. The other feedback loop is between your architecture and the system itself. Of course, you don't have that if you are creating a brand new system. It's not yet up and running. You just have some design, but that situation, that greenfield situation, hardly ever happens anymore. So we always have some kind of a system already running, and we can also try out those architectural decisions in the system, and we should also listen to the system, but we should look at the system and should understand what's going on in the system as our architecture emerges or evolves. So what are ways to speed up those two feedback loops? Well, let's first have a look at why we would want to do that. And this goes back to the whole purpose of doing architecture. What is architecture? I've already hinted at it a little bit, that architecture is not just creating an architectural design document. That may be involved, but there's something much more important. And this is where the real value of architectural thinking or doing architecture is. It is in reducing the uncertainty that is present at whenever you need to create something new. Whether it's a new project or a new epic or a new feature that you have to develop, there's always, at the beginning of that development, there's a lot of uncertainty. This is represented in this picture by this cone of uncertainty. This is a very old visualization of that uncertainty. Things can be a lot more expensive or cheaper than you think, or your estimates may be wrong upwards or downwards, we think this technology will help us, but maybe it won't. So that's a lot of uncertainty, and what this cone represents is that uncertainty is reduced over time as time goes on. And what we're basically saying here is that the purpose of doing architecture is actually to help reduce that cone of uncertainty more quickly. And architecture does that. Please notice, I'm not saying architects, I'm saying architecture. Doing architecture does that by doing research, basically by trying stuff out or looking stuff up, or by analyzing things, validating stuff, and by making decisions. Every decision that is made, every design decision, reduces the uncertainty. So how can we help speed up the reduction of that uncertainty? Well, it is by, of course, shortening that feedback loop. If you take your architecture decisions using a slow feedback loop, then you will basically have a less reduction or a slower reduction of that uncertainty than if you have a quicker feedback loop. I've tried to visualize that here. I don't know if I was very successful. But anyway, you can create better architectures quicker. And of course, it allows you to deal with change, because you can deal with a lot more change in this type of rhythm than you can here, which of course is the whole reason that we go for iterative development. So what are ways to speed up that feedback loop? Well, I have 5 tips for you. And those are not just tips for architects. Let me ask the question that I started with. I asked who identifies as an architect. Who here is involved, has some kind of responsibility in making these decisions that I was referring to? Let's call them architectural design decisions. Okay, that is a lot more people. All right. So that sort of confirms architecture is not just something for architects. And actually, the first 4 of these tips, they apply to all of you. The last one doesn't matter anymore for those of you who are already doing delivery and are not architects. So the first tip is actually not to look at this architecture document anymore as the output of architecture, but look at the individual architectural decisions. The second, don't worry, I'm going to go a little bit more in detail in all 5 of them. The second tip is how to get in touch with stakeholders. And it is, of course, by being open about those decisions and about the concerns that you're trying to resolve with them. The third tip is to invite feedback, which you may not always like, but it's an important part there. And then the fourth tip is to try to make your architecture documentation as simple as possible. And finally, get involved in delivery. If you are, if you are an architect, then please don't be in your ivory tower. But I'm sure that is not the case with you guys. Anyway, so let's first look at the first tip: architectural decisions. So that is the primary deliverable of the architecture discipline, the architecture work, whether it's done by architects or by a team. And I've already sort of said what I think about that architecture document. I'm not saying it's wrong to create architecture description documents. Sometimes they're needed. More about that later. But they should not be considered the primary output of the design process. The primary output of the design process is the architectural decision. It's a much smaller entity, and the smaller the entity, the quicker you can get feedback on it, right? And also, people will probably understand that smaller entity better. Like if we are considering adding this feature in the front end or in the back end. In the front end, it's going to be quicker. In the back end, it's actually, probably more future-proof. What do you think? What are your drivers? How will it affect you, right? That is a much easier question than, can you please read this 200-page document and sign off on it, right? That is the sabotage. There's one other thing why it's important to focus on those decisions rather than on the complete document. It is because of the timing aspects. In timing architectural or timing important decisions in software development is a very critical thing, right? Many people say, of course, that you should delay your decision to the last responsible moment. But then, how do you calculate that? Well, that's an interesting question. You always know after the fact, of course. But anyway, I think by the way, it's a trade-off between the risk of making the wrong decision and the cost of delaying the decision. I think that sort of that calculation gives you the right time to make the decision. But that calculation, of course, is different for every single decision, right? It would be really a coincidence if there are 3 important decisions that where all the risk of the wrong decision and the cost of delay is about they cross each other at the same time. Unless, of course, the decisions are related to each other. Anyway, what you do if you create an architecture description document and you sort of summarize, or you have all your decisions in there, you're forcing synchronization of the timing of all these decisions. And I think those of you who have created a design document ever, they will probably remember that there are some decisions in there that you would rather have delayed, but you haven't done that because if you hand in a document for approval or for sign-off or for feedback, and it doesn't have all the decisions, that people are going to say, it's not complete. Why are you asking me to read an incomplete document? And vice versa, of course. There's probably some decisions that you already made 2 months ago, but nobody dared to act on it because the document hadn't been approved yet, right? So that's really not very smart to try to synchronize the timing of all these decisions. So that's another great thing that we get by focusing that architecture work on the decisions, the individual decisions, rather than on the document. So that, of course, means that if you want the feedback on those decisions, don't make the same mistake as with the document, waiting for it to be perfect before you dare to share it with the others. No, be open about it. Be vulnerable. Be open. Actually, that's what the next tip is about. Ask for feedback. And one great way to do that is to use tools that people are familiar with to ask for the feedback. For example, if you say, I'm working on a particular architectural decision, it is in Jira, and it's open. People can actually see that I'm working on that decision, and they can see the progress, and they can give feedback on it. Another way to do it is using a wiki. Here you see a technique that has been very helpful for me. This is using Confluence, where we have a page to document one single architectural decision. And well, right now it's set to final, but if you start sharing the decision and asking for feedback while you're actually making the trade-offs, right? Am I using the right criteria to make that decision? Am I missing one of the alternatives? Right, all of that. So that will help you get feedback. So maybe this is the most important section of that page, is the comment page, the comment section. Of course, that does mean that you are going to get feedback, right? And feedback is not always positive, right? But I guess we have to create an environment where people also dare give that feedback. I was also at the talk by Mrs. Carpenter about the aviation disaster. That was very full. And she gave a great, she told a story about an aviation disaster and then said, one of the things that changed after that disaster was that the atmosphere in the cockpit, right? The crew, she called it crew resource management, but it was about the attitude of people, the captain, and his ability to listen to feedback, basically. And I think that is, and she then sort of transposed that lesson learned to the IT environment, and I think the software development environment. And I think that is exactly what's going on here. If you are an architect, or if you are working on an architectural decision, make sure that people feel safe to give you feedback, right? So, and don't start, if you get the feedback, don't start defending the design, right? Sometimes you see in job description of architect that they have to convince, they have to have the ability, the competency to convince stakeholders that something is the right design. I think that's wrong. I think they should have the ability to be vulnerable about their design and always, open to the possibility that they have missed some important driver and that the design actually turns out to be wrong. I think that's even essential if you want to have real evolutionary architecture. Anyway, there was a bit of a sidetrack. So the fourth tip is to simplify your architecture documentation. And I have the word template here because the architecture documentation template tends to be a great, if it exists in your organization, tends to be a great reflection of the state of the organization in terms of agility. What we see is, the last decade I have seen templates for architecture documentation that were over 50 pages. Just the template, right? This is an empty architecture document. It's over 50 pages. Well, imagine trying to get a fast feedback loop with your stakeholders based on that document. It's impossible, right? So how do these templates become so big, so bloated? Well, what I've discovered is that people tend to, they start out with a small template, but then everything that ever goes wrong in that organization ends up as a new chapter in the architecture template. So, oh, there was a big mess up with, I don't know, some database thing. So, okay, let's add a database view to the architecture template. Ooh, we had this big security incident. Oh, there has to be a new security view in the architecture, right? So they use it as a knowledge repository for everything that they have ever seen go wrong. And it becomes very big. I don't think, a template should be abused as a knowledge repository. But the architects then go on and do exactly the same thing because everything that they have already sort of researched or figured out that they think might be of interest to someone in the future about this system, they also add to that document, right? So the document itself becomes bigger and bigger. What is the purpose of that document anyway? I think that is the question that we have to ask. So what we of course want to do is we want to only have sections in that document for the most common concerns, like, okay, is this going to be feasible? Right? That's a concern that everybody has about a new feature. Is it feasible? Can we build it? Right? That should be clear from an architecture document. We should not have placeholder sections or anything else that just makes it bigger. So what we want to do is create living and minimal architecture documentation. And how do we do that? We look at the goals of the documentation. If you look at how these architecture documents are used in these organizations, then you actually can see that there's 3 quite different goals for that. The first reason that the documents are there is to show stakeholders that their concerns are being addressed. Usually, it's a risk-related concern. You know, if you look at a waterfall process, very often there is a sign-off phase where the architecture has to be signed off. Why is that there? Because the business stakeholders, the people that are paying for that change, they have to be sure that their concern, which is that it's actually going to be feasible, has been addressed. So that's the first goal that you have. The second goal that people have with these architecture documents is storing knowledge for later. And the third goal is what we have been talking about in tips 2 and 3. It's to collaborate about architectural decisions. And if you look at these 3 goals, you see that they have a completely different rhythm, right? The approval, the sign-off is a one-time thing. You know, after it's been signed off, that document is baseline. That's it. Storing architectural knowledge for later, you know, like putting diagrams or models that can help the team later on understand, you know, or do bug fixing or do troubleshooting. That requires not just different timing, you know, because it's something that you don't do once, but you have to update it. But it also requires a different language because your audience is different. The stakeholders who are signing off on your document, they speak a completely different language than the stakeholders who later on have to maintain the system, right? So it doesn't make any sense to try to put that in one document. And this is how you get these big documents that nobody reads. So what is a nice way to split that? Well, just look at the 3 different goals and realize that we actually need 3 different ways to communicate those things. So if you see here, this loop here represents the architectural decision-making loop, right? We're making decisions. And we call that the architecture microcycle, by the way. It's driven by stakeholder concerns. And it leads to decisions that have to be made. And it leads to architectural knowledge. Those are 2 quite different things. So, as I said, it requires different language, different timing, so put them in different places. Put your architectural decisions in some decision register, use Jira or a wiki or whatever. Put your architectural knowledge, including all the diagrams that you would like to make, etc., in some knowledge repository that you maintain, and that's actually low threshold to maintain. It shouldn't require, you know, a new version of a document to be created, which then has to be reapproved, etc., etc. This is one of the problems that you have with these big architecture documents. So, some low threshold knowledge repository. And then from time to time, when you need to convince the stakeholders that their concerns are being addressed, either because there's a sign-off moment or an approval or a stage gate, then you create what we call an architectural view with this. Just the specifics, it represents a snapshot of your decision register and your knowledge repository. And if you do it smart, I've seen one example where people just had to press one macro button in a wiki and it would generate that snapshot for them. Right? So they didn't even have to write a new document for it. And that goes into the, let's say, into the record as the baseline for this particular budget or project or initiative. So that's basically how to reduce the size of architecture documents. I don't know if the sum of the old documentation is reduced by this, but it certainly is more goal-oriented and probably in a place and in a language that is more useful to the organization. Right, so far the tips for everybody. Now, of course, the tip, get involved in delivery. That's just for those 15 architects that are in there. And I'm sure you're already doing this, otherwise you wouldn't be in this conference. You would probably be at some business architecture conference or something, I don't know. Anyway, if you're a software architect, make sure that you code the parts yourself that have the most impact in terms of risk and cost. Remember, that was the goal why we're doing architecture. The business goal of doing architecture is to reduce risk. So don't be worried that that level of detail is below your pay grade, right? This is actually one of the biggest causes of things going wrong between architecture and development, is that there is this kind of a barrier of abstraction levels between what the architects are doing and what the teams are doing. Architecture is a vertical function. Architecture is about crossing that barrier, about translating between different levels of abstraction. The greatest metaphor for that is by Gregor Hopi, the architect elevator. Have you guys seen that? Gregor Hopi says an organization can be compared to a skyscraper, and the floors in that skyscraper are the organizational levels, but also the level of abstraction. And the architects are not, should not be confined to a particular floor, because the architects are the elevators. They connect these levels of abstraction. They connect the levels of the organization. So never say, okay, that's too detailed for me. I'm not allowed to do that as an architect. Make sure you understand what's going on in the levels in the engine room, in the levels below you, and be able to translate that to the boardroom or the higher levels that you are connected to. So, how much time do you have left? 8 minutes. 8 minutes, including Q&A? Okay, good. I will I think I'm going to skip this and answer questions. These slides will be shared afterwards. So maybe I did a quick survey among our community of architects about shortening the feedback loop, and I got some interesting results. Well, let me find one that's interesting. Politics. It's not about technology and requirements, costs versus risks. It's about power in the organization. Well, okay. Unless dealing with other architects, it's better to focus on the outcomes of architectural decisions rather than the technical solution itself. Focusing on the technical solution invokes strong opinions that are not helpful. Does anyone recognize that? Some of you do. Okay. Right. So these are basically the 5 tips for shortening your architectural feedback loop. Architecture decisions are the primary deliverable. Continuously share the concerns and decisions. Invite the feedback. Be open, be vulnerable. Be open to the possibility that your design is wrong. And simplify your architecture documentation template and get involved in delivery.